Presentation of this program is made possible in part by grants from Health Communications Incorporated, the Life Issues publisher. For over 20 years, HCI has published books that help people change their lives, books that celebrate and connect diverse people, countries, and cultures. And the Heritage Bookstore and Health Catalog, Virginia Beach, providing holistic health remedies, including the entire line of Edgar Cayce products. And Unity Renaissance Church, Chesapeake. Home is where the heart is.
This is New World with Christopher Naughton. Tonight, the American spiritual vision.
Does a nation have a soul? Is there a spiritual calling or destiny for every country? And if so, then what is America's? Good evening and welcome to what I hope is going to be the first in a series of specials on PBS. Tonight, the American spiritual vision. What are its foundations? Where is it heading in the next century? Well, four guests join me tonight, two in the studio, two by way of satellite. We're going to be inviting your telephone calls a little bit later in tonight's program as well. Gary Amos is with us this evening. He is an attorney, he is an author and a professor of government and law at Regent University, historically associated with the Christian Broadcasting Network. Gary has written two books directly on point with tonight's topic. One is Defending the Declaration, How the Bible and Christianity Influenced the Writing of that inspired document, and he's also the co-author of Never Before in History, America's Inspired Birth. Corinne McLaughlin is the co-founder of the Center for Visionary Leadership in Washington, D.C., and she and her husband, Gordon Davidson, are also the co-authors of the seminal book, Spiritual Politics, Changing the World from the Inside Out. Mark Victor Hansen is with us tonight from Los Angeles, and recently, 3 of the top 6 selling books in the country had his name on them. He's co-author of the best-selling Chicken Soup for the Soul series, and recently he had his own television special on the Paxson Network. And in Chicago tonight, no stranger to PBS. She has had several of her own specials on the network. Carolyn Mace, author of Anatomy of the Spirit and Why People Don't Heal and How They Can. For those of you watching on the PBS stations picking us up live tonight, again, we're going to open up our telephone lines a little bit later in the program. You'll see that 1-800 number at the bottom of the screen. Well, about 15 years ago, John Nesbitt wrote a book, Megatrends 2000, and he said something to the effect that the era that we're living in right now, right before the turn of the century, would be a preeminently spiritual one. And I think there's no doubt that there's a surge, there's a great resurgence going on here. Carol, let me toss the first question to you. What do you think is driving this?
I think that inherently there is a sense of a new paradigm that's been said before, but I believe that paradigm is an instinct that says we've come of age in terms of having the ability to either destroy all of life or unite all of life. And there's an impulse that's begun inside of us that, even though a lot of people may not be aware of it, that impulse is there, and at some level, the unconscious perhaps, people are aware of it, and there are entire spiritual uprisings, emergences within people where they know that time has come to participate in uniting life because we've reached a very significant crossroads.
You know, the interesting thing is the last decade of virtually every century, we can go back to the 1890s, the 1790s, my goodness, we could probably go back to the 990s. There is a surge in all things spiritual, interest in those things. What makes this, Gary Amos, what makes this particular decade, this particular century different from the others?
This is the first century in history in which nations of the world have experimented with materialism as a philosophy to try to downplay the natural religious impulse in people, to think that there are no moral absolutes, or that there's no God or spiritual being out there who is directly interested in how we live our lives. And in this century, we've had mechanized genocide and killings of tens of millions of people, and we've experimented with no spirituality, and we've seen the fruits. Whether it was Pol Pot in Cambodia, whether it was Mao Zedong in Red China, whether it was Stalin, or whether it was Hitler. We've seen the fruits of not having any spirituality. And I think that at the end of the century, it's time to as she was saying in Chicago, we're looking for a meaning for life.
You know, Mark, in your book, Chicken Soup for the Soul, and in some of my previous interviews with you, you've said that the age we're coming to now is the most spiritually and entrepreneurially rich we've ever had in history. So let me ask you here on the program tonight, why did you say that?
I think what happens is two things. We're in the most spiritual and abundant time. I mean, the stock market is rocketing. But I think the soul of people, which everybody's saying is hungry, and the way you see the soul as hungry is that what happens is the storyteller is the soul of society. And, you know, you don't sell as many books as we have without people being hungry for a story. But it's not just the stories that we tell, but what every spiritual system says, there's always a parable, a story within the story. It's like a little teenager came up to me and said, Mark, what you do is 4 noodle stories. They're so good, I got to tell my best friend, mom, dad, and even my dumb brother. I think everybody has a story, and I think if that story can get out, if people are willing to experiment with their story, and we're now doing Chicken Soup for the Global Soul, one story from every country around the world, and that's going to be our Millennium book. We hope that people will get together by telling their story, and we'll stop all the terrible things and start having what Carolyn talks about, is that your biology becomes your biography, or vice versa.
You know, it's interesting because your books, and again, I know they're selling in the tens of millions. What's interesting about Chicken Soup for the Soul, which is indicative of this spiritual movement of the 1990s, is that they're not religious, Mark, or at least that's not my spin on it. Corinne, I don't know if you've had a chance to actually read some of Mark's book, but the interesting thing about it is it seems to touch the heart and soul of all of us. Again, Buddhists, Catholics, Jews, what have you. And this, to me, may be the new paradigm that Carolyn Mace was talking about a few minutes ago.
Well, Chris, if I can hitchhike on it just real quick.
Yes.
When I just went to China, where we're #1 bestseller, I had 2 letters, one from the head of government who's a fan of our books, and one from the head of Buddhism. I spent the day at a monastery with a female monk. It's called a Mung, M-U-N-G, and I asked her this story. I said, why does a story work? She said it's the only thing that goes from one heart to another heart.
That's it. I think that's really it, Corinne.
Well, I think everyone is waking up. We're finding that we thought that life was all about just collecting more stuff, more material things. And we're finding that that's not bringing enough happiness to us. And the people that don't have the stuff, that aren't able to make it economically, they're not happy either. It's like, and our technology was supposed to give us more time to relax and enjoy life, be with our family, our friends, you know, get more deeply into our spiritual life. And that hasn't been the case. So I think people are finding this restlessness, this searching inside, where they're looking for something deeper. They're looking for more of a spiritual life, because that's the only thing that's going to make a difference today.
You know, very interesting dynamic, too. If you look at the Harris polls and the Gallup polls of the last, 10, 15 years, there's been this movement. People have been leaving mainstream churches, and they've been going either to the spiritual right, to evangelicalism or Pentecostalism or charismatics, or they're moving to the spiritual left, to mysticism, New Age, New Thought. I interviewed Matthew Fox recently, and Carolyn, I know that you studied with him a number of years ago, and he told me, Chris, if the churches and synagogues don't give people their mysticism and a personal experience with God, they're going elsewhere.
That's right. That's right. I know that I have long believed and seen a pattern that religion tends to be far more of a political structure and spirituality far more of a personal journey. And I think that the desire in people to construct their own spiritual path, as well as to make contact with an intimacy of God on their own, is very profound. That's a profound feature of this emerging New Age. There is a inherent, the way people are following their spiritual path has previously been a part of convents and a part of monasteries. To go directly to God is something that's been kept away from mainstream because it's so powerful. And now it's pouring into the mainstream as people seek a path of spirituality instead of the collective religion that was, as I said, a far more political structure.
Well, you know, along those lines, I think in one of your books you said that too, the most monumental historical events in the last 50 years have spiritual significance. One is the opening of Vatican II. And the second one is the Dalai Lama leaving Tibet. Now, what do these two have in common, and how is that affecting American spirituality in the 21st century?
I think they have a profound team of events, because with the Dalai Lama leaving Tibet, the message that was able to come to the world was the sacredness of Tibetan philosophy and Eastern philosophy, and a spokesman of great dignity emerged into the public that would not have otherwise been there, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness. And on the Western front, with Catholic mysticism, Vatican II reconstructed the entire politics of the Catholic Church, suddenly giving the priests and the nuns, the sisters, an opportunity to have a level of authority in their lives they never had before. And much to the surprise of the church, many of them decided to leave the church because they suddenly felt empowered enough to be spiritually who they were without the need to reside within a monastery. Those two events cracked open the mystical world, and it gave way for people to access profound teachings and very sacred texts that previously to that were not in the mainstream public. So suddenly people were pouring into the territory behind their eye. In addition to the territory in front of their eye, a new vocabulary was created, a psycho-spiritual world was opened up, and the path of the mystic became familiar to people as opposed to foreign and removed and vague and in fact unknown. And this triggered numbers of spiritual experiences that could never have otherwise happened had these two forces, Western mysticism and Eastern mysticism, not poured into the culture simultaneously.
Well, you know, this is interesting because even behind, let's say, evangelicalism, which has seen a great resurgence here in the 20th century, in the last 2 decades especially, it shares some of that mysticism. And I think that maybe some people would not use the term mysticism with evangelicalism in the same breath, but, you know, Gary, laying on of hands, slain in the spirit, words of knowledge, speaking in tongues, these are, you may not call them mystical, but they are certainly a much more personal awareness and experience of God within oneself, as opposed to traditional Judeo-Christianity. True or false?
Absolutely true. And we saw that first in this century with the Azusa Street revivals in Los Angeles in the early part of the century. Then we saw a resurgence of it again in the late 1940s with the Pentecostal movement. But then, interestingly enough, in the late 1960s and the 70s to now with the charismatic movement, beginning with the Jesus movement, California. There is a common yearning for people both in like Christian denominations and those who are not of the Christian faith for a spiritual life, a spiritual relationship. Now, speaking from a point of view of Christian theology, the Bible teaches, and both Roman Catholic theology and Protestant Christianity teaches that God has built into every human being a spiritual need to seek the Lord. And so whether one is Buddhist or whether one's Shinto or whatever religion or Christian, one of the things that Christianity shares with these other faiths is a belief in people's basic spirituality.
You know, I wonder what the Founding Fathers would say about our conversation tonight. What would they say about the spiritual state of affairs as we enter the 21st century? Well, you might find an answer in a history book, your Bible, or maybe on the back of this $1 bill. Let's take a look.
The American spiritual vision, much like that of the nation itself, is an interweaving of faiths, cultures, and backgrounds. Out of diversity, unity. Out of many, one. For some, the vision is rooted in our European heritage. But that's only part of the story. Native American Indians who first inhabited the land possessed a rich spirituality, intimately tied to the earth and the cosmos. A Hopi Indian legend says that the elders told their people to look to the east and await the return of their lost white brother, who would come back, bringing knowledge. His advanced reason and will was meant to complement the heart and the intuition of the Native American. And when the white man did come, himself running from spiritual persecution, he came with science, industry, and war, driving the natives westward and their wisdom underground. Some say until these two principles merge, America will never fully express her soul and true spiritual destiny. For many 17th century Europeans, crossing the ocean to the New World, religious freedom was the greatest motivating factor. From New England Puritans to Maryland Catholics, Virginia Huguenots, and Pennsylvania Quakers. The nation's first permanent settlers landed at Cape Henry, Virginia in 1607. Before moving on to settle Jamestown, they planted a cross in the ground, a symbol of their spiritual vision. Some 50 years later, King Charles II of England directed John Locke, a leading mind in the age of the Enlightenment, to write the Constitution for the young colony of Carolina. It became an American model for tolerance and religious pluralism. It specifically granted religious privileges to all, Christians, Jews, Native American Indians, even heathens and other dissenters. No other colony before this one, English or otherwise, had ever started with guarantees for liberty of conscience. In the early 18th century, a nation not yet born, seeking its own identity, began to find it. In the spiritual fervor of the Great Awakening, charismatic preachers such as John Wesley and Jonathan Edwards swept up and down the colonial coast with their electric evangelizing messages. These great social events drew huge crowds. Evangelist George Whitefield even impressed a young Benjamin Franklin, who said, "From being thoughtless or indifferent to religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious." As England heaped political oppression on the states, calls for freedom were preached from the pulpit. Strategies for revolt, including the Boston Tea Party, passed through secret religious societies. For although America's leaders were predominantly Christian, they were something else as well. Many of America's founding fathers were members of ancient metaphysical societies. There is more than enough evidence to suggest that some were Rosicrucians, members of the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. Others were Freemasons, a society at that time based largely on mystical concepts found in all world religions. As many as 50 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. George Washington was a Freemason, but he was also a vestryman in a Virginia Episcopal church. Apparently his attendance was flawless, except during the war and his presidency. On the occasion of his first inauguration, he proclaimed that no people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they advance to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. Years before, Anthony Sherman, who was with Washington at Valley Forge, stated that Washington had a vision of an angelic presence there before battle. He was shown the birth, progress, and destiny of the United States, and 3 great crises that the nation would face. While the stars remain and heaven send down dew upon the earth, he was told, so long shall the republic last. The whole world united shall never be able to prevail against her. Our third president, Thomas Jefferson, invoked the Supreme Being 3 times in the Declaration of Independence. Yet Jefferson's private beliefs may never be fully understood. In letters to Benjamin Rush, he called himself a Christian, but questioned the divinity of Jesus. He wrote the Jefferson Bible, an examination of the 4 Gospels. Yet he too was a Freemason, and was known to use a secret code reminiscent of the Rosicrucians. When he wrote his epitaph, he judged his Virginia statute for religious liberty above all of his other achievements, except for his authoring of the Declaration of Independence. When it came to matters of the spirit, Benjamin Franklin did not follow the script. Raised a Presbyterian, he kept a Bible in the top drawer of his desk at all times. He admired George Whitefield's evangelizing, but he became a Unitarian, believed in reincarnation, and touted astrology in his Poor Richard's Almanac. And yet, it was Franklin's traditional spirituality that saved the first Constitutional Convention in 1787. With the threat of dissolution, Franklin implored the delegates, "In the beginning of the contest with Britain, we had daily prayers in this room for divine protection. Have we now forgotten this powerful friend? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men." Franklin's appeal broke the deadlock, and the new nation moved forward. Congress appointed Franklin, along with Adams and Jefferson, to design a new seal for the nation. The reverse side of the Great Seal, which today is found on the back of the $1 bill, is a long-standing Freemason symbol. The spiritual vision of the all-seeing eye of God is atop the pyramid, representing materiality. The Latin phrase, annuit septus, means God favors our undertakings. By 1791, 15 short years after the start of the Revolution, the new nation had achieved a religious liberty and successfully separated church and state, the likes of which the world had never seen. This due in large part to Virginians. Thomas Jefferson, who coined the phrase, a wall of separation between church and state. And James Madison, the father of the Constitution, who said, the religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of each, and it is the right of every man to exercise as these may dictate. Out of these extraordinary beginnings came the rise of a wide range of distinctly American religions. The American transcendentalism of Thoreau, Emerson, and Whitman. The inclusion and assimilation of a significant American Jewish population, particularly during 20th century immigration. The embodiment of African American religious influences and the black spiritual experience at the very core of Martin Luther King's mission. And the election of the first Roman Catholic president. If a national magazine in the 1960s suggested that God was dead, the surging interest in spirituality today, traditional, evangelical, Native American, and mystical, suggests otherwise. America, a nation based on unity, tolerance, and inclusion, may yet manifest its spiritual vision and destiny in the 21st century.
I have to thank Gary and Corrine. Some of the elements and pictures of that feature were directly inspired by their books. You know, I hesitated to include that story about George Washington at Valley Forge. It seemed almost too fantastic. It's something that I think personally I wanted to believe in, but George Washington, angelic vision at Valley Forge. Corrine, where does that come from?
It actually was in the National Tribune, and Anthony Sherman reported it. He was with him at Valley Forge. But I think, you know, Washington was a very spiritual man. Why not? And I think to show the destiny of the United States, to warn of crises ahead, was probably something that he would have been inspired by.
I never learned this in history class, Gary Amos. Why not?
Well, traditionally, to write a history book that is intellectually respectable, you can only put in a history book that which can be absolutely verified by some written document. And although Anthony Sherman recounted the story years later, Washington never put it in any of his own writings, and it's in none of the correspondence between him or any of his friends, so the historians are forced by the tools of the trade to consider it apocryphal, and so not the sort of thing that they would include in a traditional history book.
But interesting thing is that I think Sherman uttered this, sometime in the 1820s or 30s?
Yes.
And he said, now the three great crises, if you folks were paying attention to that feature there, the three great crises that the angel told George Washington about, I understand, Corrine will correct me if I'm wrong here, was the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and apparently one which we're yet to experience. Now, when Sherman shared this information with the nation, Civil War hadn't happened yet.
It was 40 years before the Civil War,
Right.
And the vision was written in some newspapers, you know, within a decade before the Civil War.
Carolyn, I know you're trying to jump in there. Go ahead.
Well, during my years as a publisher, a manuscript came into my office that I thought was just exceptional. And let me say that how much I agree with Gary when he says, of course, history, in order to be credible, has to be recorded as it happened with the events they can, in fact, track. And that's unfortunate in some regards that we cannot record psychic history and emotional history, thought history, because that's what we're now talking about, is the psychic history of our country. And those facts are not measurable nor found. But several years ago, when I was a publisher, a manuscript was submitted to me, and it was entitled The Autobiography of George Washington. And the history, of course, I can't give you this evening because it's too long, but what a rich story. At any rate, the manuscript had been sitting in an attic for 45 years by the time I got it, and it was in the care of Masons. And in the manuscript, now mind you, I want to repeat, autobiography, which means it was, and I use the word in quotes, channeled, by a woman who was 79 years old and blind. I mean, the story's phenomenal. And George says that he was indeed quite involved in mysticism, and that he had an event in which he fell off his horse and was knocked out, and that his spirit came out of his body and was shown the Civil War and shown the suffering that would take place at a place called Valley Forge. He was shown the size that the United States would eventually reach, and all the way to another ocean. And he felt a great deal of grief when he saw the Civil War, and he felt that the vision the country had to give to its beginning people had to be strong enough to see if it could prevent that war. And the other thing I'll contribute, and then I'll close on this, is that in that manuscript, he said that Benjamin Franklin and Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, Hamilton, all of them very clearly knew that they had been born together to birth this nation, that it was no accident that men of great talent in different fields, geniuses, if you will, in different fields, the field of philosophy and banking and politics and statesmanship.
Well, the interesting thing, Carolyn, is that at one point in time they all said to a certain degree that they were Christians as well. So I suppose
That's right.
It is up to us to try to ferret out the Christianity and the mysticism, or maybe where they overlapped. Now I want to give, yeah, go ahead, Mark, go ahead and jump in, please. And then
I want to hitchhike on what Carolyn said. First of all, I'd never heard it before, but I love the idea of keeping a psychic history, and our fastest selling book right now happens to be Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul Journal. And what is astounding, we now have the best-selling journal in history, and it's because I believe the heart and the soul of every person really wants to journal and record that psychic, that emotional, that thought-filled and thoughtful history. And I'm sorry that we haven't got a parallel line of what historians want to say, and then have the George Washington and Patton had the same thing. If you'll watch the movie,
Yes.
and I'm a scholar in Patton, he knew what way the war was going to go.
Yeah, well, and you know, and here again, oh, Mark, delicious. He believed himself to be the reincarnation Caesar, and he believed himself to have been at the great battles of history, so he very much felt that he was following the psychic history, and that he was in fact laying the pathway, not even so much from a physical history, but at a psychic level, which would then literally create the physical history.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Carolyn, I just want to plus, I'm in absolute alignment with you, and I just want to say that what he felt as all those people were drawn at that time, I believe that we all chose to incarnate it at this time because, you know, the whole Dickens things, it's the best of times or the worst of times, but just the fact that we can be in 4 different geographical places. This is the first time in human history. Ben Franklin would just get goosebumps right now, as would George Washington, to be able to communicate like we're communicating and see what's happening literally globally and pretty soon internationally. And you can do it macro, worldwide, and you can do it micro inside your body, which is your
Kareem
strength.
McLaughlin and then Gary Ames.
I think yes, they would be very amazed and inspired that we can all have this conversation together. However, I think they would be really disappointed that so many Americans are apathetic, that we have this great democracy, people don't vote, you know, they're not engaged, and they also never intended, when they talked about the separation of church and state, that all they intended was one religion shouldn't dominate another, or that the state shouldn't interfere in the practice of religion. They never intended that we shouldn't be able to talk and have public dialogues on spirituality and how it relates to the public life. I think they would be the first to say, hey, wait a minute, that isn't at all what we intended.
Yeah, good point. And Gary, I'm going to toss it to you next. But it's interesting, about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a history book that was distributed among high school kids in the nation. And to be politically correct, they said Puritans were people who traveled from afar. How much are we losing when we're blanching not just religion, but spirituality out of our public institutions?
Okay. I really need to respond to something earlier.
Please do.
And I don't want to be the guy who spoils the party, because our other three were...
There's freedom of speech, I think, religious tolerance and pluralism was one of the
As a trained
founding
historian, I have to strongly dissent from the notion of psychic history, because this is one of the great problems. You've used the history of the Freemasons and the picture, for example, of the emblem on the Great Seal. And a lot of the stuff that's spoken about by the Freemasons is channeled history, just like this supposed history of George Washington from a 79-year-old lady who lived 45 years ago. It's concocted, it's created, it's not real history. The Freemason Society started in the year 1717 in London. It didn't start going off the track with a lot of mysticism until the late 1790s, and then in 1826 and thereafter, when you had the anti-Masonic controversy with the death of a military captain who was killed. It had originally been basically a Christian organization, which was then made very Eastern and mystical by Albert Pike in the 1860s and by Albert Mackey in the 20th century. They claim all the founding fathers as members when very few of them really were. There were only about 2,000 people in all of the colonies who were actually members of the Masonic Lodge. There are 3 lodges in Virginia which have George Washington's name as one of the founders when he couldn't have been. So I have to really say something very strongly here. We can't say that George Washington said this stuff, and a lot of.
No, and I think Carolyn at least prefaced that.
Let me say here, that's not what I was saying.
Okay, I must have misunderstood.
No, Gary, I was not saying that at all. I said that I agree with the charting of literal history, and I presented this as something in a totally different realm, not as the accurate parallel to literal history, not in the least.
Okay.
Well, the thing we need to remember about history and what's recorded is who recorded it and for what purposes. Part of the problem is, with recorded history, the victors record, the history in a lot of the battles and a lot of things that happen. And I think sometimes there's little shreds of evidence here and there that always aren't investigated so deeply. And that's what's fascinating to me. Ben Franklin, for instance, brought gifts to a community in Philadelphia, Ephrata, published their books on his press. And yet, this is just a little footnote in the Yale papers of his that studied his work. And this was a community that many said, believed a lot of these non-traditional ideas. Rosicrucians were a secret society, so we don't know for sure, because their whole purpose was to be secret. Because unfortunately, this country was founded to protect, the practice of religion, and yet, even back then in 76, you were often persecuted. Different states didn't allow other religions in. There was a lot of intolerance. So if you had ideas that weren't popular, depending on what the surrounding community is, you had to be very careful about it.
Hey, I've got a history quiz, but I can't give the pop quiz to Gary or to Corinne because they know the answer. So Mark and Carolyn, first one who has the answer, blurt it out, okay? On what day did Thomas Jefferson die?
July 4th.
What year?
Let me see now. 17.
Well, I'll save you. I'll save you. You get half credit, at least Carolyn. Both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on July 4th, 1826, 50 years from the date that they signed the Declaration of Independence. Now, here are 2 people, maybe 2 souls, who come together, decide they're going to forge this nation. They become president. Then they turn out to be nearly mortal enemies. They reconcile prior to their death, and then on their respective deathbeds, they refer to one another. Now, in an age where we're searching for meaning, this coincidence, do we trip into an area of superstition, or do we look at this and say maybe there's some providential agency behind it?
Here again, I always think that coincidence or synchronicity is what it is. It's what I would call the X factor voice of God. I don't believe in coincidences. I think there's a symbolic counterpart to everything we do. And the July 4th date was a date, obviously, where a new thought form was incarnated into the world and signed in a document and imprinted into the human psyche. That's not a day. That's a birth force. That is a psyche birth force, July 4th. And so I believe that the people whose psyches are part of that phenomenon of this Declaration of Independence are very deeply tied to that date, to that zone. Their souls were part of the maintenance of that contract, of that document. So the fact that their souls would choose to leave at the same time, to me, is a choreography of great divinity.
Yeah,
it's not to be overlooked.
Not just, in other words,
that.
It's not happenstance, stuff happens. And yet, isn't it interesting, most of us did not learn of that in our history classes.
Yeah.
Maybe some of us did, but certainly I don't think any teacher would start talking about the deeper meaning behind it, and perhaps in separation of church and state, they feel that they can't. But what a loss for students who can't look at it.
Chris, I'd like to talk to that if I could, and that is that what I hear Carolyn saying versus what Gary's saying is Gary says, let's just have a linear history. And then I think it was Gray who said, you know, history is some level of interpretation, so it looks to me like it's fictional history. Where Carolyn wouldn't vote for it, I would like to vote for a psychic history that parallels it, because what Carolyn's saying is correct. We had the notion on July 4th of liberty, and I think that right now when we hit July 4th this year, as we go towards the millennium, I think what happens is we're going to have the birth of a psychic level of freedom and individual independence literally around the world because of things like internet, because of entrepreneurship, because all kinds of stuff. I think we're having a psychic evolution that is unparalleled in human history, and I think it needs to be recorded.
Gary, go ahead, Carolyn.
If I may conclude that, I have taught psychic or symbolic history along literal history now for a long time, because I think it also parallels what I teach students, which is their literal physical history of their lives along with their emotional psychic history. And it draws an intriguing parallel and a very powerful one for them to understand that their psyche was developed alongside and through these events. And I agree with you completely that this new pattern of a hologram, if you will, say Homo noeticus person is emerging as we enter into this new force field where we're pulling together, because this is the first time that we've had this signal that says unite, because the consequences of non-uniting are as serious as they have ever been on your planet.
Well, what you're saying is exactly right, because we've hit a critical time, and the critical time is either we're going to all make it together, or being that there's trying to happen, a war is trying to happen, we're not going to make it. We drink the same water, we breathe the same air. For the first time in human history, 6 billion people, they've never had that many people ever, and we're going to go to 10 billion by, I think, 2010, have got to figure out how do we mutually coexist. And what that is that's all the invention of concept, which goes to details, which goes to refinement, all of which is psychic before it becomes literal manifestation.
Totally. So we have so again, there's still we still have spiritual differentiation here in this nation, but we're quite aware of the fact that we have got to become more tolerant of one another, more open, more working together. And Gary, these are your very words. We discussed this last week sometime.
Yes, and you know, I'm sort of at a disadvantage here because I do not share the outlook of our guests who are on the TV.
That's okay.
And for many, many years, at least the last 50 years, most of your professional historians have dealt with America's founding history from a materialistic and very anti or non-spiritual viewpoint. So they have played down any elements of religion or spirituality. So I have to I'm trying to be careful when I talk about there was a real sense of religiosity and spirituality in the main at the time of America's founding. And America is a spiritual country, and I would like to suggest a uniqueness about our country. If you look at the nation of India, 4,000-year history, very spiritual country, but very much different in its history from America's history. We look at Japan, we look at the various Asian nations, look at Italy, look at the Holy Roman Empire in an earlier day in Europe. People all over the world in all periods of time have been essentially and fundamentally religious. The histories of the ancient kingdoms of the ancient world were all the histories of their various religions.
So how are we different?
I think that one of the things that's so unique about America at the very beginning is our founders consciously studied all of history and studied the mistakes of all the nations of humankind, and were choosing to try to find the best and the highest principles and ideals. A lot of that came from Judaism, some from Roman Catholicism, some from Protestantism, but they also studied Aristotle and Plato and Cicero, and they were asking a common question empirically: what out of all of this heritage, what principles are the best for society, for mankind? And that search for not only spirituality in a mystic sense, but high principles of right and wrong and how we live together as decent people in society, and they put those principles in words in our founding documents, is what made America
and
unique.
a great degree of tolerance, which which heretofore could not be appreciated or was not appreciated in other nations. This nation built itself on tolerance, spiritual tolerance.
And what's happened in the
Gary,
meantime, we have lost our spirituality, so the principles have become dry.
Carolyn, go ahead with your question. Or you want to address Gary?
I want to say to Gary, I think your answer is absolutely superb. And I don't really think that what we're saying challenges what you're saying at all. I think you are presenting the strongest description I've heard of the beginning of this nation. I think this nation has always been intensely spiritual, and when we look at today and say that it's gone dry, the spiritual principles, it's as if the juice has been soaked out of them. I think that's absolutely accurate, as we see played out, shall we say, in Washington and in other political arenas. I don't think there are many statesmen left in this country that people genuinely respect. Our politics are laughed at, not only here, but no matter where I teach in the outside world now. But I think that's part of what's motivating people, is people are morally starving. I notice no matter where I work or in our country or other places, that people are more interested in managing each other's dishonesty than in honing their own honesty. There is this incredible sense that when you do business, the person opposite you begin with the premise that they are dishonest. You begin with the premise that they are somehow or other going to cheat you in a work deal. That our internal human politics have become spiritually as dry as our external ones.
Let's hope that's changing, Corinne.
Yeah, but I think what's really key that's happening here is that your point that you made, Gary, about there isn't enough of the understanding of the spiritual dimension of the founding of this country. When I started studying it, it really inspired me that that really is our foundations. And that belief in tolerance and diversity is so key. Mm-hmm. And I think as you look at, we would totally agree with a lot of what you're saying, is that to be able to respect our differences and to find where's there common ground, because I think that there's been a real sense of trying to play up our differences, to create the controversies, particularly between conservative viewpoints and liberal viewpoints, different religious viewpoints. We all have a lot more in common than we have differences. And I feel like a lot of our work at the Center for Visionary Leadership has been to focus on those commonalities, to find the common ground. Whether it's in religion, we do interfaith dialogues. Whether it's in racial healing, we bring together people from different races to have honest dialogues about our experiences. I think this is what the Founding Fathers intended, is that we have to appreciate those differences and yet try to understand and learn from each other. That's what's really key.
Do you think that today that religions are losing their hard edge, that we're becoming more ecumenical? And I don't mean just among Christian faiths, but among Buddhists and, again, Jewish folks.
That was the reason I wrote Anatomy of the Spirit. I took that position and I united, from my perspective, a small sample of Judaism, Christianity, and Buddhism, the Eastern philosophy, to show how they were intertwined in one's biological system.
But Carolyn, there's a fear. I think that there's a fear that somehow we're moving towards, perhaps, if there's a greater interweaving, crossing over between religions, there is a fear that we're moving towards a one-world religion, that perhaps the garden is only going to have all roses in it, or all irises or daisies.
Chris, you want to know something? There is always panic before change. That's the nature of the human psyche. And there's always the exaggeration of what the consequences are going to be. And there's always the Armageddon that precedes change. This is human nature. It's a way of preventing it's the same kind of panic that happened when agriculture saw the industrial age and said, uh-oh. But the industrial age came and everybody benefited from it, more or less, shall we say. But it's the same thing. That's not going to happen. Religions aren't going to get eclipsed. That's panic talking. That'll never happen. What might happen, hopefully, is there'll be an appreciation of the truth in each other, like Gary would say, that the deep, spiritual, profound principles that are found in every single text will be presented as a universal truth that says whatever rituals you have, keep. But in the meantime, appreciate that principles and teachings such as thou shalt not kill and respect life are found everywhere, which is an indication that from the position of fundamental truth inherent in our soul, we are identical, and that we need these truths to be active in our soul in order to be a flourishing human being.
You know, there's something real interesting about where we're broadcasting from tonight, and about 15 miles from this studio, the first permanent settlers landed at Seashore State Park, which is in Virginia Beach, and again, they planted that cross in the ground, their spiritual vision. And about 10 miles west of here, we have the largest Christian broadcasting communications corporation in the world. And then about 15 minutes east of here, the most documented Western mystic psychic, Edgar Cayce. It's all here in Virginia Beach. So I have to ask you, is this a coincidence, or maybe does God have a sense of humor?
I know I'd like to talk to that if I could, Chris, and that is that I think that for the first time all these things can commingle, not only in America, but I believe that America is probably the model and the prototype. And what's going to happen, what Gary said, is that we've lost our spiritual juice. I think people get juiced when they start getting to coalesce and bounce off other stuff. And what Carolyn was saying is you go back from chaos into order. That's the whole premise at the beginning of Genesis and the model that we use in my books and my corporations. And what we're seeing is that there's a lot of chaos around our spaceship, and for the first time, you take a character like Jesus, which I'm understand that model better than any other model. He's the only guy that said, look, there's fundamental abundance for everyone, and if you got fundamental abundance, we go from scarcity to abundance. We no longer have a reason for war, and for the first time, America as a model may go all the way around the planet. Everybody will be fed, clothed, housed, and sheltered, and then they can do higher level spiritual thinking, which they'll have enough time to do because they'll get out of survival and they'll get into abundance.
You know, I think it's really key that you're talking about both the ARE being close by here and the Christian Broadcast Network. Both groups would say the importance of prayer in affecting our personal lives and affecting the world. And I think that's really key, that this was right here at the founding of this country, that understanding. And that's, you know, even if you don't work with prayer, you understand it in your own way, to just realize that we each can have an effect on the world, that we're not disempowered. It's not like things are passing us by. But that importance, and I think the Founding Fathers would say this too, that we need to really connect with our inner soul or spirit, to connect with that deeper spiritual life, to have an impact in the world, to pray for our leaders, to pray, to meditate on crisis situations, to ask for the highest good. You know, that's what's really key today. That's what we need to do together.
I don't think it's accurate to assume that we haven't been in touch with our spirituality, or that there's such a dearth here. I don't think that's accurate to assume at all. There has always been a sense of prayer and presence in this nation. It may need to be upgraded now, that's certainly true. And the way it needs to be shaped for the, say, emerging culture to come needs to be rethought through. And that's why things are changing. But the presence of spirituality has always been active in this nation, as it has in every other nation. And when it comes to abundance, I'd like to address this point, and that's, I think abundance is a companion and not an enemy. It has long been presented as the enemy to spirituality, ergo church and state, body and spirit, and been divided. And I don't think abundance is the enemy. I think rather the way I would look at the world is that when I lay out all of the countries, to me each country is playing out a drama unique to itself that we each can learn from. Dramas of separation, division, dramas of non-forgiveness, dramas of the question, can Israel and Palestine unite? Can two peoples unite? That is a lesson for all of us, and it's being played out there. And in our country is the question of abundance and the management of abundance. And I believe to eventually illustrate the life and the truth that abundance is not an evil, and it does not contaminate the soul. It in fact can enrich the soul, and there is such a thing as right livelihood, and that would be of benefit to the earth to have that thought form be born.
Yeah, I think it's really important to realize that we can do well by doing good, and that we can use the abundance that we create to help others. You know, and I think there's a whole movement now in Spirit at Work, which is really about bringing our spirituality into the workplace, and that's really key. I think that is very encouraging, rather than the separation of spirit and matter.
Again, whether we're talking about the more evangelical right or perhaps in more New Age, New Thought left, I don't think that prosperity is such a foreign idea today. So perhaps, I mean, at least not here in the 1990s. You know, folks, we could talk for another hour, 2 or 3, I'm sure, tonight, but we did say we'd open up the phone lines. So let's try to take a couple of calls before we have to sign off tonight. Robert is up first tonight. Robert, good evening. You're on New World.
Good evening.
Go ahead with your question, Robert.
Yes. I would like to direct my question to Mr. Amos, if he would care to comment on it. I understand that George Washington was a deist. Is this true or false?
It's not correct. George Washington made an Orthodox confession of faith to be an Anglican vestryman. He presided over baptisms at Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg. He prayed for miracles, believed in miracles. He was a Trinitarian Orthodox Christian in every way. I know there have been a lot of books, particularly in the 1960s, trying to say that Washington was not an Orthodox Christian. But if you read his speech, which he gave to the Delaware Indian chiefs, he told them that unless he advised the Delaware nation to accept the religion of Jesus Christ, to become a successful, happy, and prosperous nation, and to have God's blessing.
Robert, thank you for your telephone call again. We're going to try to move through a few more. Gregory is up next tonight. Gregory, go ahead.
How are y'all doing tonight?
Good. We're doing real well.
Okay. My question is more in the form of a comment. I played Sir Francis Bacon in a play called I, Prince Tudor Wrote Shakespeare a few years ago. And, pardon?
No, go ahead with your question. Continue, Greg.
Oh, okay. And in studying about Bacon, I found that one of his main things was that he hoped and prayed that science, art, religion, and philosophy would become one again. And that freedom is what this country is based on. And that his connection with the Masons also is all very intriguing. And I'd like anybody on your panel to comment on that.
Everyone has a comment. I'm going to throw it first to Corinne McLaughlin, though.
Well, I think Bacon really was some of the inspiration behind the founding of America. He even wrote in The New Atlantis, at one place he said, "The New Atlantis that you call America." So I think that there's a whole deeper side to an understanding of what Bacon was proposing and the inspiration of his work in the founding of America that was very key. Yes.
Gary Amos.
If I'm not mistaken, Sir Francis Bacon was impeached for misuse of his office and went to jail and was fined, lost his title, and wound up disgraced.
Well, many reformers find that kind of fate. I mean, unfortunately, they threaten the powers that be.
You know, it's it's this Virginia connection. I don't know why there's been so much Virginia influence in all of this, but Francis Bacon, of course, I think was a member of the company that founded colonies in Carolina and Virginia. And of course, we had George Washington, founder of our country, was a Virginian, and Jefferson and Madison. Now, again, this is going to sound a little bit like that question, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? But Gary, if we look at the Declaration or the Constitution, is there any doubt that they were divinely inspired, that these two Virginians were divinely inspired? Well,
the Declaration is certainly something that was different from Francis Bacon. The reason he was part of the Virginia Company was because he was so close to the king. But Bacon didn't adhere to the principles of the Declaration. Now, divinely inspired, that's a technical term that you have to be careful about using, but is the Declaration of Independence and a definitely unusual document in that there was nothing ever like it before in history? Absolutely, because it is the first document of international law written by a person who was speaking for an emerging nation, that we believe in, that every individual person has God-given inalienable rights that government can't take away, and that the purpose of government is to protect those God-given inalienable rights. No other country in the world had ever been founded on those principles, and most of the world up until that time had been following the teachings of Aristotle, which said that the individual rights meant very little, and that what was most important was the power of government and the imposition of law and order, which is what some of my conservative friends seem to emphasize today. And in fact, Bob Bork, in his book, Slouching Toward Gomorrah, says that all of America's problems trace to Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, America's greatness traces to the Declaration of Independence, and that's how I separate company with my conservative friend Bob Bork.
All right, let's go.
I would like to talk
go ahead,
real
Mark.
quick if I could, Chris.
Yes, go right ahead.
And that is just say, the first thing he said, I don't know much about Bacon except that what he said is, let's integrate all these thought forms, and that's where I think we're really going, and that's what Carolyn was talking about. Abundance is our friend, not our enemy, and the fact is that once we get in our right livelihood, whatever it is, we can have a plethora of our abilities, and our talents actually multiply, and I'm convinced that that's true, and I could prove it, but we don't have time for it in this show.
That's right. Let's go to Joanna next. Joanna, good evening.
Hi, I have a two-part question for Mr. Amos, if that's okay.
Quick if you can,
Sure.
please.
First, I'd like for him to explain the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and maybe the influence of the English common law on the founders. If you could touch on that.
Thank you.
The Declaration of Independence was like a corporate charter that gets a corporation started. It lays out the basic principles and the purposes of the corporation. Then the Constitution is like the Constitution and bylaws that then organizes the powers. In every corporation, the board of directors and the officers of the government have to do what the corporate charter says. And in this country, we should be following not only the Constitution, but the Declaration of Independence. And as far as the influence of the English common law, most of the principles that were used by the American founding fathers had been hammered out over the centuries, the previous 600 years, in the English common law. So they had a lot of good resource material to work from when trying to pick the best ideas.
We've got just about a minute left. What is spirituality going to look like in the 21st century in this country, Corrine?
I think that each person is going to get more deeply in touch with their own inner divinity, their own soul, the essence within them. I think there's going to be more respect for the differences, and yet finding some commonalities so that we can really have these honest dialogues and find how can we respect each other and work together for our common goals.
Gary Amos.
I wish I knew. I'm not a prophet. I can't predict the future. I know that human nature seems to be the same century after century, and I certainly trust there will be an awakening where that we will try to do much better than we sometimes do.
Mark Victor Hansen in Los Angeles. What does the next century look like spiritually, of course?
I think that we're going to have better stories told. People are going to understand their own story and create a new story and make the place infinitely better than it's ever been.
And Carolyn Mace, last words.
Well, I hold hope, but I'm also a realist, and I don't project that everybody's going to have spirituality and be happy and all get along. I don't believe that. I believe that there'll be many more crises and that we're going to need spirituality, but I also think that we've been talking about only a very Western culture today in this program, and that perhaps it is our culture, the way we can get media across, the way we read, the way we write, that for us, the future might hold a more spiritual openness. But for the rest of the world, I think we're going to have, not just for the rest of the world, we're going to see polarities. In other words, we're going to have as much need for a new spiritual awakening and as much trauma that it won't.
I wish we had at least another hour, but I want to thank the two guests I had here in the studio tonight. Gary Amos, author of Defending the Declaration, and Corrine McLaughlin, co-author of Spiritual Politics. Guys, thanks for joining us. And also Mark Victor Hansen. I know you were hopping around the country, Mark, and I'm glad that you got back to LA for one day to join us. Thank you so very much. We'll see you soon, I hope, and pick up on the next Chicken Soup for the Soul book. And Carolyn Mace, as always, thank you for being with us. Next time you come to Virginia, Carol, we've got a big box of Godiva chocolates for you. Thank you. That's a personal note. Mark and Carolyn, thank you. And thank all of you watching tonight. If you've enjoyed tonight's program, or even if you didn't, get in touch with your PBS stations. We'd like to do more programs along these lines. For all of us here at New World, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Good night now.
Presentation of this program is made possible in part by grants from Health Communications Incorporated, the Life Issues publisher. For over 20 years, HCI has published books that help people change their lives, books that celebrate and connect diverse people, countries, and cultures. And the Heritage Bookstore and Health Catalog, Virginia Beach, providing holistic health remedies, including the entire line of Edgar Cayce products. And Unity Renaissance Church, Chesapeake. Home is where the heart is.